Senate Majority Leader, which is a big-time position. And again, he was the youngest person in American history to assume the top spot in the Senate. Sometimes your majority leader has much more power than your vice president. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So in January of 1955, at the age of 46, Johnson became Senate Majority Leader, again the youngest in American history to assume the top post in the United States Senate. Who served longer as Senate Majority Leader than any man in history? Come on. He replaced Johnson as Senate Majority Leader. Gave an incredibly nice eulogy. Mike Mansfield. Well, just keep that in mind. All right. Now, this was kind of interesting because who was President of the United States when Johnson was Senate Majority Leader? Eisenhower. Very good. And Johnson did an excellent job of working with the Republican Party, reaching across the aisle. He was very good at that. So as Senate Majority Leader, Johnson worked very well with President Dwight D. Eisenhower, despite the fact they had different party affiliates, right? They worked very well together. In July of 1955, shortly after becoming Senate Majority Leader, he's still 46, he suffers a severe heart attack. He suffers a severe heart attack at the age of 46. About 6 months after he becomes Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson suffers a severe heart attack. And he survives. What's really is kind of amazing because it's a lot different in 1955 than it is 2018 if you have a heart attack. Well, he was hospitalized and worked from his hospital bed for 5 weeks, ironically at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. So after his heart attack, it took him 5 weeks to recover, and he worked from his hospital bed. Most people would take that 5 weeks off, not Lyndon Johnson. He would work from the hospital bed. Matter of fact, it was stated by historians that he probably worked harder than ever after the heart attack, and was once quoted as saying, "I never think of politics more than 18 hours a day." So he was kind of a workaholic. And he actually worked harder after his heart attack, according to historians, than before. And he was once quoted as saying, "I never think of politics more than 18 hours a day." Now, you can write this down if you want, but you don't have to because you should know this. Obviously, Johnson had his intentions on the presidency in 1960, but John F. Kennedy was nominated on the first ballot when Wyoming gave the 23 delegate votes. And so what did he settle for, Hunter? The vice presidency. And I can just tell you that Johnson's experience as vice president was not a very positive one for him for 2 reasons. There were 2 reasons why serving as vice president of the United States was not a positive experience for Lyndon Johnson. Anybody want to take a guess of any of the 2?
Kennedy didn't like him.
Well, not so much. Kennedy really didn't like him, but he didn't like Kennedy either because he didn't like... Well, that's the other one. So we'll do this one first. He did not enjoy playing second fiddle to a less experienced man. He didn't like playing second clarinet or second saxophone in the band. You see what I mean? You want to be first chair, don't you? My God, you want to be first chair, especially if you're a senior and you've had 3 years of band experience in high school. You don't want this freshman to come up and be first chair. Well, Lyndon Johnson did not like playing second fiddle, so to speak, to a less experienced man. Now, Caitlin, you said something about what?
He didn't like that he lost power.
Yeah, he actually lost power. He was the most powerful man in the United States Senate. He lost power going to the vice presidency. What do you do if you're vice president normally? What's most of your job? Traveling to other countries and doing good PR work. He was a man that served in the Senate. He was Senate Majority Leader. He passed laws. He kicked butt and took names. He didn't want to go to Algeria and meet with Algerian officials. He wanted to be in Washington. So the two reasons the vice presidency was very negative for him is he didn't enjoy playing second fiddle to a less experienced man, and he was the most powerful man in the Senate and lost power. Close friends and colleagues often stated that Johnson's years as vice president were the most miserable of his life. Close friends and family would tell you that the years he spent as vice president were the most miserable years of his life. Now, you don't have to write this down because you should know this. After the assassination of President Kennedy in November of 1963, Lyndon Johnson became the nation's 36th president, sworn in right on Air Force One before the trip back to Washington. We will be talking about this. President Johnson is going to be elected to his own term in 1964, and he's going to move out of President Kennedy's shadow. Although I will tell you, he did a tremendous job of serving the remainder of Kennedy's term the way President Kennedy would have wanted it served. You have to give him credit. A lot of people wouldn't have done that. But he did become his own man after his own election, which we'll talk about in 1964. He decides not to run for re-election in 1968, although he could have served more than 8 years as president. Anybody know why he chose not to run in 68?
Health.
Well, health, I'm sure, was part of it. But what was happening in 68 that put tremendous pressure on him? The Vietnam War. So President Johnson surprises everybody by getting on national television on March 31st, 1968, and tells everybody in the world that he will not seek another term as their president, that he has to devote his time not to campaigning but to solving the Vietnam War, which he really created. Okay? And we'll talk about that later. Now, I want you to write this down. According to historians, President Johnson's downfall was the war in Southeast Asia known as Vietnam. His downfall was the war in Southeast Asia known as Vietnam. This is the quote that historians summed up Johnson and the Vietnam War. They said, quote, he was obsessed with it, possessed with it, and ruined by it. Okay? He was obsessed by it, possessed by it, and ruined by it. And that's probably the truth. Now, we'll get into a little early history. Did he inherit the Vietnam War? He did. Well, he kind of did, yeah. It was going on in the latter stages of Kennedy's presidency, but he escalated the war. And then didn't want to be the first president ever to lose a war. And he just kept committing. It's like a gambler. You go into a place and you play Keno. Okay? And pretty soon you got 20 into it. Pretty soon you got $40 into it. Pretty soon you got $80 into it. Pretty soon you got $100 into it. And the most you can win is 100. Now you've totally been possessed by the machine, and so you throw in another 100 to win. You spend 200 to win 100 because you don't want to walk out of there a loser. Well, that's kind of what he did. He just absolutely was obsessed by this war, did not want to be the president to lose a war, and he committed way more than he should have, and it led to a hell of a mess. And we'll get into that later. Okay? Now, after he was out of office, after Richard Nixon was inaugurated as president in January of 1969, Lyndon Johnson retired to his ranch in Texas, which was in Stonewall. Okay, remember that's the last stop for President Kennedy, supposedly on November 22nd. He retires to his ranch in Stonewall, Texas. And what do all presidents do after they retire, Pete? They write their memoirs, and then they build a presidential library somewhere for them in their honor. Okay? So when he retired, he published his memoirs, and the Lyndon B. Johnson Library opened on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin. So if you ever went and watched the Longhorns play there, and you went to the library, it'd be the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library. Okay? Well, in 1972, Johnson suffers a second heart attack and survives. In 1972, Johnson suffers a second heart attack and survives. However, on January 22nd, 1973, and because we give you a specific date, you can guess that he had a third heart attack and died. Okay? On January 22nd of 1973, he had a third heart attack and died. Now you think about that. So how long did he live after President Kennedy's assassination? How long? Okay, 10 years. Not a long time. As with President Kennedy, President Johnson's body lay in state at both the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., which Kennedy's did, but his also laid in state at the library at the University of Texas also. And Johnson was then buried next to his mother and father in the family graveyard on the ranch in Stonewall, Texas. So his body laid in state both at the University of Texas in Austin and under the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. He then was buried next to both his parents in the family graveyard on his ranch in Stonewall, Texas. Which might lead you to ask me what question?
What about him?
Yes! Not Wiley, MVP of the day. What about Lady Bird? Never remarried after the death of her husband. Never remarried. I want you to really pay attention to this. She then dedicated her time and effort to the Highway Beautification Act, which we'll talk about. You should know what that is. And the National Wildflower Research Center. And I'm going to tell you why that's important. So she dedicated her time and effort to both the Highway Beautification Act and the National Wildflower Research Center. Now, I'll just start with the National Wildlife Research Center and tell you what that is. Simply a nonprofit organization that's devoted to preserving and reintroducing native plants in the United States. You're going to see an example of that when we walk across the Potomac River, just before we walk across the Potomac River Bridge from Arlington. You're going to see a park dedicated to Lady Bird Johnson because of her dedication to the National Wildflower Research Center. What's the Highway Beautification Act, kiddos? You all should know that because I'm sure you've done this from student council or 4-H or somebody. What do you go do? Pick up the highway. Certain people on a certain stretch. The Washakie 4-H has from this mile marker to this mile marker, right? And you go out on a group thing and you pick up the garbage that's along the around the route. That law was passed during the Lyndon Johnson administration, which we will be talking about later. And she dedicated her life to that. Lady Bird Johnson eventually died on July 11, 2007. She was 94 years old and is presently, obviously, buried by her husband in Stonewall. So she lived many, many years after her husband's death, never remarrying, dedicating her life to others, dying on July 11, 2007. Here's the wonderful Lady Bird Johnson right there. July 11, 2007. Age of 94, buried by her husband's side. All right, now, what we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to talk about what Lyndon Johnson did from the time he assumed the presidency after Kennedy's death until he's elected to his own. And then we'll move on, because his administration is going to be called the Great Society. Okay? All right, good job. We'll finish this up as we go.